There is a version of the First World War that most people carry around in their heads without ever questioning it. It involves mud and poetry. It involves generals who made terrible decisions from comfortable chateaux far behind the front lines. It involves young men going over the top into machine gun fire while their commanding officers sipped tea. It involves grief. It involves futility. And somewhere in that version, there is almost always a kind of dignity preserved for the men who died, a sense that they were victims, that they suffered nobly, that their deaths meant something even if the war itself did not. That version is not entirely false, but it is carefully incomplete. What it leaves out is the texture, the daily texture of what it was actually like to exist inside the industrial machinery of that war. Not the moments of attack or the moments of death, but the long stretches in between, the weeks, the months, the years. What it was like to be a human body inside a system that had no particular interest in human bodies except as fuel. What happened when the horror did not arrive all at once but instead settled in slowly, so slowly that you stopped noticing it. What happened when the abnormal became the routine? Because that is the story that does not get told cleanly. The story of normalization. The story of how men who had grown up in villages and towns and cities, men who had worked in shops and factories and fields, men who had kissed their wives and played with their children and argued about cricket or football or the price of bread, how those men arrived at a place where certain things that would have been unthinkable in any prior context became simply part of the day, not because they were broken, not because they were monsters, but because the war was organized, because it had a logic, because the systems around them kept running, and they kept running with those systems, and after a while the systems were all there was. This is the history that the official records tried to contain, the medical reports that were classified, the letters that were censored, the testimonies that were never collected because the men who could have given them were dead, or because the men who survived did not speak, or because the institutions that might have listened were themselves complicit in what had happened. This is the history of 20 behaviors, 20 specific and documented patterns that became ordinary inside the trenches and hospitals and supply chains of the First World War. Not extraordinary, ordinary. That is the word that should disturb you most. The war began in the summer of 1914 with a mobilization that was itself a kind of machine. The European powers had spent decades preparing their railroad timetables and their conscription rolls and their ammunition stockpiles, and when the mechanism was triggered, it moved with a speed and scale that no one had actually planned for in human terms. Within weeks, millions of men were in uniform. Within months, the Western Front had congealed into its famous shape, a line of trenches running from the English Channel to the Swiss border, roughly 460 miles long and largely immovable for the next 4 years. The trenches were not romantic. They were not even particularly interesting as military architecture. They were ditches. They were wet ditches, mostly, because the geology of Flanders and the Somme Valley meant that groundwater sat close to the surface, and any excavation immediately began to fill. They were cold in winter and searingly hot in summer. They were home to rats in populations that soldiers described consistently as beyond counting. They smelled of wet earth and rotting wood and human waste and decomposing flesh. And men lived in them for weeks at a time, sometimes longer, rotating in and out of the front line in a cycle that became its own kind of routine. Within that routine, the first behavior that became normalized was something so basic, so physiological, that it seems almost absurd to name it as a historical phenomenon. It was the relationship soldiers developed with human remains, not the act of dying, not the violence of combat, but the simple presence of dead bodies in the environment, treated not as events, but as features of the landscape. In any other context, a dead human body produces an immediate social response. It must be acknowledged. It must be named. It must be removed, prepared, buried, mourned. There are rituals that are thousands of years old precisely because the human community cannot function if it normalizes the unburied dead. The presence of a corpse demands a response. In the trenches, this demand could not always be met. The front line was under fire. The ground between the lines was impassable except in darkness and at enormous risk. Bodies accumulated in no man's land. They accumulated in collapsed sections of trench. They accumulated where shell craters had opened and bodies had fallen in and been covered and then uncovered again by subsequent shelling. After the major battles, the scale was such that recovery was simply impossible. At the Somme in 1916, the first day alone produced nearly 60,000 British casualties. Many of those men lay where they fell for days, weeks, sometimes indefinitely. The logistics of retrieval could not keep pace with the logistics of killing. What this meant for the men who remained alive was that they learned to walk past bodies. They learned to eat near bodies. They learned to sleep in positions where the smell of decomposition was simply the ambient smell of where they were. Veterans described stepping over the same corpse for 2 weeks until it became as unremarkable as a tree stump. They described eating their meals with dead men, visible at the edges of their vision, and feeling nothing, or feeling something that had become so familiar it no longer registered as feeling. Medical officers and chaplains who visited the front wrote private notes about the way soldiers seemed not to see the dead at all, as though the eyes had learned to edit them out. This was not callousness in the way the word is usually meant. It was adaptation. The brain does what it must do to keep the organism functioning, and if the organism must function in an environment saturated with death, the brain will find ways to manage that. What is significant historically is that this adaptation was recognized, documented, and then administratively exploited. Commanders understood that men who had been at the front long enough would not break down at the sight of casualties in the way that new arrivals did. This was useful. It was factored into calculations about unit rotation and the timing of offensives. The normalization of the dead was a resource. The second behavior that became routine was directly related to the management of sleep, or more precisely, the management of sleep deprivation. The front was never entirely quiet. Shell fire occurred at all hours. Stand to, the period of alert at dawn and dusk when attack was most likely, demanded full alertness twice a day. Working parties went out at night to repair wire and carry supplies. Sentry duty rotated through the small hours. The result was that genuine, uninterrupted sleep became, for many soldiers, something that happened only in fragments, in positions that were not horizontal, in conditions that would not in civilian life be recognized as sleep at all. Men learned to sleep standing up. They learned to sleep in the few minutes between tasks. They learned to sleep through artillery fire that would have been terrifying in any other context, because the brain, sufficiently exhausted, will sleep through almost anything if the noise has become familiar enough. Veterans described waking up and not knowing what year it was, not knowing where they were, not knowing whether the men around them were alive. They described hallucinatory states that emerged not from injury or illness, but purely from sustained sleep deprivation combined with constant sensory stress. They described seeing things in no man's land that were not there, hearing voices, losing track of conversations mid-sentence. None of this was treated as a medical condition. It was treated as the normal state of a soldier. Officers were expected to maintain functioning on minimal sleep. Other ranks were expected to perform physical labor and maintain vigilance on whatever sleep they could piece together. The medical establishment of the British Army and the French Army and the German Army and every other army involved in the war did not categorize chronic sleep deprivation as a medical problem. It was categorized as a condition of service. The paperwork did not reflect it. The casualty rolls did not record it. It simply became part of what soldiers were expected to endure, and because they endured it, it became proof that it was endurable. The third behavior was the normalization of a particular relationship with vermin, specifically lice. Every soldier on the Western Front had lice. This is not an approximation or an exaggeration. Contemporary medical surveys, when they were eventually conducted with any rigor, found infestation rates that were effectively universal in units that had been at the front for any significant period. The lice lived in the seams of clothing, in hair, in the wool of blankets, in every crevice of the fabric environment that surrounded a soldier's body. They were constant. They were not eradicated because they could not be eradicated under front-line conditions. The delousing facilities that existed behind the lines provided temporary relief that lasted only as long as it took a man to return to his unit and come into contact with the already infested equipment around him. What this produced, over time, was a behavioral routine that veterans described with extraordinary consistency across all the major armies. The act of searching through clothing seams and cracking lice between thumbnail and fingernail became something men did while talking to each other, while waiting for orders, while eating. It was as natural as scratching. The men called it chatting, from the army slang for lice, chats. It was communal. It was public. It was unremarkable. What it represented, beneath the mundanity, was the complete collapse of the bodily privacy and hygiene standards that these men had grown up with. Young men who had been raised in households where cleanliness was a mark of decency, where the body's condition was a reflection of moral standing, now lived in a state of permanent infestation that they had not only accepted, but had incorporated into their social routines. The shame that would have attached to this condition in civilian life had been entirely stripped away, not because the men had become indifferent to dignity, but because dignity had been redefined by the environment they were in. Or rather, it had not been redefined. It had simply been postponed, indefinitely. The fourth behavior concerns what happened to food, or more precisely, what happened to the category of food itself, as a concept, as something with qualities beyond simple caloric content. The ration system of the British Army, and its equivalents in other armies, was designed to deliver a minimum nutritional load to the frontline soldier. It succeeded at this, more or less, in the sense that mass starvation did not occur. It failed at almost everything else. The food that arrived at the front was cold, frequently contaminated, often partially spoiled, and delivered in conditions that made any attempt at preparation impossible. The famous bully beef, which was a tinned corned beef product, was eaten cold because heating it required fire, and fire revealed position. Hardtack biscuits, which were essentially compressed flour tablets, were so dense and hard that men soaked them in water or tea before eating them, and even then they were described as having approximately the texture and palatability of compressed cardboard. Men ate in proximity to the things described above. They ate in trenches that smelled of everything the trenches smelled of. They ate with hands they had not washed, using equipment they had not cleaned, and they learned not to notice this. More than that, they learned to be grateful for it. The arrival of food, however terrible, was an event with positive emotional valence because it represented a break from the other things the day contained. Men who had grown up eating family meals with some expectation of pleasure came to experience a kind of genuine happiness at the appearance of a tin of cold beef that they would have rejected with disgust in any other context. The recalibration of the threshold for satisfaction was so complete that veterans, decades later, sometimes described army food with a kind of nostalgia that confused their families. The fifth behavior is harder to describe because it requires addressing something that the official record kept at a considerable distance. It concerns the relationship between frontline soldiers and the concept of orders. Not the issuing of orders or the following of orders in a mechanical sense, but the psychological experience of receiving instructions that you knew, or strongly suspected, would result in your death, and nevertheless carrying them out. Not out of heroism, not out of ideology, but because the alternative was a court-martial and potentially a firing squad, and because the social structure of the unit made refusal not just dangerous, but unthinkable in terms of what it would mean to the men around you. This experience of what historians have sometimes euphemistically called moral injury was routine. It was the regular condition of the frontline soldier, particularly in the periods leading up to and during major offensives. Men were told to go over the top at a specific time. They knew from experience, from the experience of previous attacks, and from the visible evidence of the ground in front of them, that this was likely to kill them. They went anyway. And in going, they demonstrated not courage in any simple sense, but something far more disturbing, which was the complete subordination of the self-preservation instinct to institutional authority, achieved through months of training and the accumulated social pressure of the military unit. Commanders documented this. They documented it in the clinical language of military reporting, using phrases like "morale is acceptable" and "men are steady," which meant that the men would still follow orders, even when those orders led directly into machine gun fire. The documentation itself was a form of normalization. The language did not name what was happening. It translated the psychological reality into bureaucratic categories, and the bureaucratic categories were then filed, and the filing made it institutional, and the institution processed it as unremarkable. And in a sense, it had become unremarkable. That was precisely the problem. The sixth behavior involves a specific and well-documented medical phenomenon that the military authorities worked very hard to classify in ways that would minimize its administrative consequences. This was the condition that soldiers called shell shock, that the medical establishment variously described as neurasthenia, hysteria, soldier's heart, and a range of other terms that were chosen, explicitly or implicitly, to avoid acknowledging what the condition actually was, which was a psychological injury produced by sustained exposure to terror and helplessness, and the constant proximity of death. The symptoms were varied and sometimes dramatic. Men who had been buried alive by shell explosions and dug out would lose the ability to speak. Men who had witnessed the deaths of close comrades would develop paralysis with no neurological basis. Men who had been under continuous bombardment for days would shake uncontrollably and be unable to stop. Men would go blind or deaf, or lose the ability to walk, with no physical damage to explain these losses. And men would also simply cease to function in ways that were less dramatic and therefore easier to miss. They would become unable to make decisions. They would become hypervigilant and sleep less and less. They would become emotionally flat, which in the context of the trenches looked like calmness and was therefore sometimes praised. The military response to shell shock evolved over the course of the war in ways that reveal a great deal about institutional priorities. Early in the war, men exhibiting these symptoms were frequently treated as cowards or malingerers and subjected to punishment. As the scale of the problem became impossible to ignore, because the numbers were simply too large to dismiss, the medical establishment began to develop treatment approaches. But these approaches were consistently oriented toward a single goal, which was the return of the soldier to duty. The question that drove medical intervention was not what has happened to this man and how do we help him recover, but rather how quickly can we get this man functional enough to send back to the front. The forward psychiatry approach, developed primarily by British and French military medicine, involved treating men as close to the front as possible on the explicit theory that distance from the front increased the likelihood of men refusing to return. It involved suggestion therapy, which in practice often meant telling men that their symptoms were not real and that they should simply stop having them. It involved, in some documented cases, electric shock treatment applied to paralyzed limbs or mute vocal cords, not as a treatment for pain or illness in the conventional sense, but as a mechanism for forcing the nervous system to resume function. The rationale was that if the symptom could be removed, the man could be returned to duty. Whether the underlying psychological injury had been addressed was not a question the system was organized to ask. And men returned. That is the part of this that most requires sitting with. Men who had lost the ability to speak, who had been unable to walk, who had shaken through days of examination and treatment, went back to the front. Because the alternative, in the first half of the war particularly, was a charge of cowardice. Because the system made return the default outcome, and any other outcome required extraordinary documentation and advocacy. Because the men themselves, many of them, did not understand what was happening to them, did not have the psychological vocabulary, did not have the cultural permission to identify their suffering as suffering rather than as weakness. And so they went back, and the cycle continued, and shell shock became one more thing that was happening all the time, that was documented and processed and managed, and that was fundamentally never addressed. The seventh behavior concerns the specific experience of being in a bombardment, not the shock of the first experience but the 100th, because the 100th experience was different from the first in ways that had profound implications for everything that followed. The first time a man was under heavy artillery fire, the terror was acute and undeniable. It produced all the physiological responses associated with extreme fear. The heart rate elevated, the breathing shortened, muscles tensed. The body prepared to flee or fight, even though both options were largely unavailable. The mind focused entirely on immediate survival. By the 100th time, or the 200th time, the physiological response had changed, not because the danger had diminished. The danger was identical or greater, but because the nervous system adapts to repeated exposure to threat in ways that reduce the acute response. Veterans described entering a kind of detached state during bombardments that they found difficult to characterize. Not calm exactly, not indifference, something more like dissociation, a sense of being present in the situation while also being slightly removed from it, observing oneself under fire rather than being wholly within the experience. Some men described this as a kind of peace. Some described it as the feeling of already being dead, of having died at some earlier point and simply not having noticed. What this represented neurologically was the result of chronic hyperarousal followed by exhaustion of the stress response systems. The body cannot sustain acute fear indefinitely. If the threat continues and cannot be escaped, eventually the physiological response shifts. This shift, which in a clinical context would now be recognized as a trauma response, was in the context of the trenches described by commanding officers as steadiness, as battle-hardened, as evidence of the making of a soldier. The language turned a symptom of neurological damage into a virtue. And because it was described as a virtue, and because soldiers internalized this description, it became a behavior that men aspired to, that junior soldiers watched in senior soldiers and tried to replicate, that the culture of the trench unit actively reproduced and transmitted. The eighth behavior was the management of friendship, or more precisely, the specific and documented way in which frontline soldiers learn to modulate the depth of their emotional investment in the men around them in response to the statistical reality that many of those men would be dead within a relatively short period. This was not a conscious decision in most cases. It was not something men decided to do. It was something that happened to them, that changed the texture of their social existence in ways they sometimes noticed only in retrospect. Men who had been at the front for long enough described a kind of emotional rationing that they found difficult to name. They would form attachments to new men who joined the unit, but those attachments had a different quality than the friendships of earlier life, a quality that veterans consistently described using words like careful or held back or not all the way. They would feel grief when men died, but the grief was processed differently than grief had been processed before the war. It was faster, it was compartmentalized more efficiently, it did not interfere with function. And they recognized this change in themselves, and some of them recognized it as a loss, as something that had been taken from them that they were unlikely to recover. The institutional response to this phenomenon was essentially to ignore it. The unit was a unit. Its cohesion was important. Men's feelings about each other were relevant only insofar as they affected unit performance. The psychological consequences of repeatedly losing close companions to violent death were not a category the military bureaucracy recognized as relevant to anything except insofar as they impacted fighting capability. And since men kept fighting, since the capability remained, the loss of the capacity for full emotional investment was simply not recorded as a loss. It was the water in which everyone swam. It left no trace in the official record. The ninth behavior concerns the relationship soldiers developed with the concept of time, specifically with futurity, with the future as a meaningful category. In civilian life, the future is a constant presence. People make plans. They save money. They plant gardens. They have children. They build things intended to last. The future is the organizing framework of almost all human activity above the level of immediate survival. And one of the things the war did, quietly and systematically, was remove the future from the psychological landscape of the men who fought in it. Not because they believed they would die, though many of them did believe this, but because the near future was so completely determined by forces entirely outside their control that projecting oneself forward in time produced nothing but anxiety. The next offensive was coming. The next rotation in the line was coming. The next bombardment was coming. The dates of these things were set by people far away, processed through a bureaucracy that had no interest in the individual soldier's relationship to time. Planning around them was useless. Hope located in a specific future outcome was dangerous because the future did not belong to you. What veterans described in letters and memoirs and eventual testimonies was a progressive narrowing of the temporal horizon. First, the far future became inaccessible, the sense of a life that would extend decades and include all the ordinary things that lives include. Then, the medium future narrowed, the week, the month. Eventually, many men existed primarily in a present tense that extended perhaps 24 hours in either direction. This was functional. It allowed them to perform their duties without being paralyzed by dread. It was also, in ways that wouldn't become fully apparent until the men returned home, deeply damaging, because the war ended, and the men who had learned to live without a future were expected to resume living with one. And many of them found that they could not simply retrieve what the war had taken. The 10th behavior involves the administration of death as a clerical function. This is perhaps the most important normalization in this entire account, because it is the one that was most completely invisible at the time and is most completely invisible in the history that has been written since. Death in the First World War was not only a physical event, it was a bureaucratic event. It generated paperwork, it generated forms and notifications and records and requisitions. And the processing of this paperwork was performed by people who were alive, who were functioning, who were continuing to carry out their administrative roles in the middle of death on an industrial scale. The casualty notification system required that when a soldier died, certain forms be completed. His personal effects had to be inventoried. A letter had to be sent to his next of kin. If he had been issued any equipment that could be recovered, this had to be logged and returned to stores. If he was owed any pay, the final accounting had to be completed. The military administration processed these requirements at a rate commensurate with the rate at which men were dying, which in periods of major offensive action could be thousands of men per day. What this meant in practice was that clerks and adjutants and regimental sergeant majors were completing casualty paperwork for men they had known personally, sometimes men they had been speaking with hours before, at a speed and volume that made any individual emotional response to any individual death functionally impossible. The system required that they abstract the man from the death. It required that they manage the name as a datum, the personal effects as a category of inventory, the letter of notification as a form letter with variables to be filled in. And they did this because they were professionals, because they were soldiers, because the system required it, and because the system was all there was. And this practice was not restricted to rear echelon clerks. Frontline officers were required to complete reports immediately after actions in which their men had died. They were required to produce accurate casualty figures. They were required to assess the tactical outcome of engagements in which the cost had been paid in the bodies of men they had led. The forms were waiting. The forms were always waiting. The translation of human death into administrative category was constant and systematic, and, because it was constant and systematic, it became in time simply the way things worked. The 11th behavior concerns what happened to the bodies of dead horses and other animals that were used in enormous numbers throughout the war. Horses pulled artillery. They carried supplies. They were used by cavalry and by messengers and by officers on inspection. And they died in numbers that were, if anything, even more difficult to process emotionally than the human dead, because horses are silent about their suffering in a particular way that men found harder to bear than the deaths of their comrades. Veterinary records from the British Expeditionary Force suggest that over 800,000 horses died in British service alone over the course of the war. The reason this matters, as a behavioral normalization, is that the dead and dying animals of the front lines produced a response in soldiers that the dead and dying men did not, at least initially. Men who had become able to walk past human remains with little visible reaction would sometimes break down at the death of a horse or a dog. The animals seemed to access something that had become unavailable in relation to human death. Some veterans described this with a bitterness that was still audible decades later. They had stopped being able to cry for men, they said, and the horses had carried what was left. Over time, this too diminished. It had to. The horses were simply too numerous. The suffering was simply too constant. And eventually, the horses joined the men in the landscape of things that were terrible and could not be addressed. But the fact that it took longer for this normalization to occur, the fact that the animals outlasted the men in the emotional response of the soldiers around them, tells you something about the sequence and the cost of the adaptations the war demanded. The 12th behavior is specifically about the management of wounds, not the serious wounds that sent men back through the casualty clearing system, but the minor wounds, the small wounds, the wounds that in any civilian medical context would have received immediate and attentive care. Cuts, blisters from ill-fitting boots that broke and became infected, small shrapnel fragments that lodged under the skin and were not considered worth the medical effort of removal. Trench foot, which was a condition caused by prolonged immersion in cold water and which, if untreated, could result in gangrene and amputation, but which in its earlier stages produced a constant low-level agony that men were expected to manage themselves. Frontline soldiers developed medical practices that would not be recognizable as medicine in any clinical sense. They shared iodine and field dressings. They drained each other's blisters with improvised equipment. They bandaged wounds and kept fighting. They developed a detailed knowledge of which wounds were considered serious enough to justify evacuation and which were not, and this knowledge shaped their relationship to their own injuries in ways that required constant suppression of normal pain responses. A man who allowed himself to fully feel every minor wound would have been dysfunctional within weeks, so men did not allow this. They found ways to manage and minimize and defer the attention their bodies were demanding. The medical establishment facilitated this by being largely unavailable at the front, except for serious casualties. The regimental medical officer was a real figure but was spread incredibly thin, was usually working under fire or in conditions that precluded anything resembling normal medical practice, and whose primary function in the eyes of the military hierarchy was to make judgments about whether men were sick enough to leave the line rather than to provide comprehensive medical care. The threshold for being considered sick enough was calibrated to the needs of the unit, not to the needs of the individual. And men internalized this threshold. They became their own doctors in the sense of making constant judgments about what level of physical distress was permissible, what could be endured, what counted, and mostly, they endured. The 13th behavior is closely connected to the previous one, but distinct from it in important ways. It is about the specific experience of trench foot in detail, not as a medical category, but as a daily reality that entire units managed as a routine condition of life in the line. Trench foot resulted from the prolonged exposure of the feet to cold, wet conditions. The trenches were flooded in winter, sometimes to knee depth. Boots were not waterproof in any meaningful sense. The feet were wet for days and weeks at a time. The condition began as numbness and progressed through swelling and discoloration to tissue breakdown. In severe cases, the flesh literally rotted. The British Army's response to the epidemic of trench foot that became apparent in the winter of 1914 and 1915 was to issue orders making officers responsible for ensuring their men dried and greased their feet. Officers were required to inspect feet. They were required to maintain records of foot condition. There were returns to be completed, showing how many men in the unit had been diagnosed with trench foot. Officers whose units had high rates were subject to criticism. What this created was a situation in which the management of a major medical problem was converted into a disciplinary matter. Men were instructed not to get trench foot. The system treated it as a matter of personal and command responsibility. And because the conditions that produced trench foot were the conditions of the trenches themselves, which could not be changed, the result was that men concealed their symptoms for as long as possible, continued to serve on feet that were progressively deteriorating, and only came forward when the damage was severe enough that concealment was impossible. The system, in other words, created incentives for men to damage themselves further in order to comply with its administrative requirements. And men complied, because the system was what there was, because to fall outside the system was worse than to suffer within it. The 14th behavior involves a particular feature of the physical environment of the trenches that official accounts consistently minimized and that veterans consistently returned to as one of the most psychologically significant aspects of their experience. This was the smell, the sustained, pervasive, impossible to habituate smell of the front. It was a composite smell made up of numerous components, each of which was separately identifiable, and each of which carried its own freight of meaning. There was the smell of decomposition, which in warm weather could be detected at considerable distance. There was the smell of chloride of lime, which was used in massive quantities to try to manage the sanitation of the trenches. There was the smell of cordite from the constant artillery fire. There was the smell of damp earth and mold and rotting wood from the trench walls. There was the smell of unwashed human bodies and clothing. There was the smell of cooking, when cooking was possible. There was the smell of tobacco smoke. And occasionally, in certain sectors and at certain points in the war, there was the smell of poison gas, which was itself an olfactory warning of mortal danger, and which produced an immediate physiological response of alarm in men who had experienced it long after the war at the smell of anything even remotely similar. Veterans described the front by its smell more consistently than by almost any other sensory dimension, and what they also described was the process of becoming used to it, of arriving at the front and being overwhelmed by the smell, and then, gradually, over days and weeks, of having it become the background of existence, the baseline, the neutral. This olfactory normalization was itself a process of distancing, of adaptation, of the brain finding a way to process constant aversive stimulation as simply the way things were. And it worked. It had to work. But it was not free. It cost something. This process of becoming used to the intolerable. It changed what the senses could do. It altered the relationship between sensory experience and emotional response in ways that persisted. The 15th behavior involves something that the official military medical literature of the time almost never named directly, and that has been addressed only obliquely in most subsequent histories. It is the specific phenomenon of men in the trenches engaging in sexual activity with each other, not as an exception or a pathology, but as a pattern that was widespread enough to be a recognized feature of frontline life, documented in private letters, in censored correspondence, in the diaries of chaplains and medical officers who encountered it regularly. The military authorities were aware of it. They did not address it, because addressing it would have required acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would have disrupted the entire moral framework within which the war was being sold to the civilian populations. What this behavior represents, from a psychological and historical perspective, is not primarily about sexuality in the narrow sense. It is about intimacy and contact and the need for physical closeness in conditions of extreme isolation and fear. Men who were facing death at close quarters, who had lost the ability to access the kinds of emotional and physical intimacy that are part of ordinary human life, found that need expressing itself in ways the civilian world would have condemned. And because the military authorities needed these men to keep fighting, the unofficial policy in most armies was to look away, to not see, to process the knowledge as something that did not enter the official record. The behavior existed. The institution that knew about it pretended it did not exist, and this pretense was itself a kind of normalization, an institutional practice of strategic blindness that kept the machine running. The 16th behavior concerns the specific and well-documented phenomenon of soldiers seeking wounds. Not death, not surrender, but injury. An injury sufficient to require evacuation from the front line, but not sufficient to result in death or permanent incapacitation. This was called in British Army slang a blighty wound, a wound that would get you home, or at least to a base hospital. And the desire for such a wound was not an aberration or a sign of particular cowardice. It was a widely shared and openly discussed aspiration that existed across the armies of all the major combatant powers. This desire is, when examined carefully, a precise diagnostic instrument for measuring the conditions that produced it. Men wanted to be hurt because being hurt was the only morally acceptable and institutionally recognized path out of the front line. The alternative paths were death or the end of the war, or a breakdown severe enough to be recognized by the medical authorities, which was itself uncertain and often followed by accusations of malingering. A wound was clean. A wound was unambiguous. A wound had a trajectory. You went through the casualty clearing system. You ended up in a hospital in England or France, and for a period of time, which might be days or weeks or months, you were not at the front. You were lying in a bed. People were feeding you. Nobody was trying to kill you. This was, in the context of the trenches, paradise. It was valued accordingly. Men talked openly in their letters and diaries about hoping for a wound. They talked about what kind of wound they wanted, whether they would be willing to lose a finger, whether a leg wound was too risky, whether a facial wound that destroyed appearance was preferable to remaining at the front. They developed detailed informal taxonomies of wounds based on their likely medical consequences. And some men, the documented cases are substantial enough to make this clear, deliberately arranged to be wounded. They exposed themselves to fire in ways designed to produce a specific kind of injury. They used their own weapons in ways that could produce injuries that might plausibly be attributed to enemy action. The military authorities knew this. They had known it since early in the war. The category of self-inflicted wounds was a recognized category in the military justice system. Men convicted of self-inflicted wounds could be court-martialed and were, in some cases, shot. But the authorities also understood that the desire itself was rational given the conditions, and that prosecuting every case would create more problems than it resolved. And so the system produced a kind of equilibrium in which self-inflicted wounding was common enough to be a recognized feature of frontline life, but was selectively prosecuted in ways designed to maintain deterrence without making the full scale of the practice visible. The institution managed the symptom without ever addressing the condition that produced the symptom. The 17th behavior concerns what happened to language. Specifically, the specific and systematic process by which the language available to soldiers for describing their experience was shaped and constrained by the censorship apparatus and by the social norms of what was permissible to say. Soldiers' letters home were censored, not comprehensively, because the volume was too enormous for comprehensive censorship, but selectively, with officers tasked with reading a sample of the men's mail and removing or suppressing material considered damaging to morale or operationally sensitive. Men knew their letters were censored. They wrote accordingly. What this produced over time was a kind of double language. There was the language of the letters, which described the trenches in terms that could pass through censorship, that used agreed-upon euphemisms, that deployed a kind of cheerfulness that the recipients at home recognized as performed, but could not decode exactly. And there was the language of actual communication, which existed in conversations, in the dark, in whispers, in the shared shorthand of men who had the same experiences and did not need to explain them. This language was rich and specific and largely inaccessible to anyone who had not been at the front. The consequence of this split was that the men who returned home were returning to an environment where the language for describing what had happened to them did not exist in the civilian vocabulary. The words the civilians had were the words of the letters, the censored words, the performed words. The words the soldiers had were the words of the trenches, the unspeakable words, the words for things the civilians had been deliberately protected from knowing. And this linguistic gap, this fundamental failure of available vocabulary, was one of the primary mechanisms through which the war's psychological damage was reproduced long after the war ended. Men could not speak about what had happened because the language to speak it did not exist outside the context that had produced it. They came home and were silent, not because they refused to speak, but because the words did not translate. The 18th behavior involves the specific and very well-documented normalization of alcohol as a mechanism for managing psychological and physical suffering at the front. The rum ration was official. Every British soldier at the front was entitled to a ration of rum, typically issued before operations or in particularly miserable conditions. This was policy. This was the institution's recognition, never stated explicitly, that the conditions it was creating required chemical assistance. The rum ration was not large enough to produce significant intoxication in most men, but it was regular. It was expected. It was part of the day. Beyond the official ration, men obtained alcohol through any means available. Wine was available in areas behind the front where French civilians still operated. Beer was available in estaminets, the informal cafes of the rear areas. Officers had access to supplies that other ranks did not. The relationship that frontline soldiers across all armies developed with alcohol was not the relationship of pleasure or social ritual that alcohol had in civilian life. It was the relationship of self-medication, of pain management, of psychological regulation, of the need to soften, even briefly, the edges of an existence that was otherwise unrelentingly hard. The military authorities managed this relationship carefully. Too much alcohol impaired fighting capability. Too little, and the men's psychological state became harder to maintain. The balance was calibrated not for the well-being of the men, but for the requirements of the institution. And the institution knew this. The records that survive from staff discussions about the rum ration are remarkably frank about the calculation involved. Alcohol was a tool. The men who needed it, who had come to depend on it, who would continue to depend on it long after the war ended, were secondary considerations. The tool worked. The war went on. The 19th behavior involves something that happened to religion, specifically to the formal structures of religious belief and practice that most of the soldiers in the major armies had been raised in, and that the military chaplaincies of those armies were attempting to maintain and provide for the men in their care. The chaplains were present. They held services. They performed last rites. They visited the wounded. They wrote letters home on behalf of men who could not write their own. Many of them were brave and dedicated men who came much closer to the front than their non-combatant status required. And what they encountered, with increasing frequency as the war continued, was that the formal structures of religious belief were not functioning as religious belief is supposed to function in relation to suffering and death. The theology of meaningful sacrifice, of suffering as spiritually significant, of death as a passage rather than an ending, of divine providence as the framework within which catastrophe could be understood, was not surviving contact with the actual texture of death in the trenches. It was not surviving because the death in the trenches did not look like sacrifice. It looked like waste. It looked like machinery. It looked like the random operation of artillery on human bodies that had no particular qualities of virtue or vice, that died in configurations that bore no relationship to any narrative of meaning. Men did not, for the most part, lose faith dramatically. They did not renounce God or theology in formal terms. What happened was quieter and more thorough. The practices of faith continued or went through the motions of continuing, while the interior architecture of faith was quietly dismantled. Men went through the forms. They attended services when services were available. They kept religious objects, photographs of families, small devotional items, as talismans in ways that reflected something more like magical thinking than orthodox belief, and they stopped expecting those beliefs to do what beliefs are supposed to do, which is to provide a framework of meaning. They had found a different framework, the framework of the unit, the framework of the day's routines, the framework of immediate practical necessity. This framework provided no comfort, but it was the framework that the conditions had generated, and it worked after a fashion, for the duration of the conditions. The 20th behavior is the most pervasive and, in many ways, the most difficult to name precisely, because it is not a single behavior but the accumulation of all the previous ones into something that constituted a fundamental reorientation of the self in relation to the world. It is what happened in the aggregate to men who had survived long enough to have normalized everything described in this account. After a sufficient period at the front, men described a condition that they variously called numbness, blankness, hardness, distance, the state of not caring. This was not depression, though it overlapped with depression. It was not psychopathy, though it shared some surface features with psychopathy. It was the end result of a sustained adaptive process in which the nervous system had progressively reduced its responses to things that had previously elicited strong responses, because reducing those responses was the only way to remain functional in the conditions that were producing them. It was the organism protecting itself by, in a sense, consuming itself, eating its own emotional capacity as fuel. Men in this state performed their duties with a competence and an apparent equanimity that commanding officers found admirable. They were reliable. They did not panic. They did not break down at inconvenient moments. They moved through bombardments and over the top and through gas clouds and past the bodies of their friends with a steadiness that was, from a military perspective, extremely useful. They had become, after a sufficient period of normalization, the ideal soldiers for the kind of war that was being fought: efficient, durable, unencumbered by excessive attachment to their own survival. They had also become, in ways that the military perspective had no framework for recognizing, fundamentally altered. The alteration was not physical, at least not primarily, though the physical costs were also real. The alteration was in the structure of the experience of being human, in the relationship between the self and its emotional world, in the capacity for the kinds of connection and vulnerability and hope that characterize a life before it is permanently calibrated to mass death. These men would come home. Many of them would marry or return to families they had left. They would have children. They would work. They would sit in gardens on summer evenings and seem, to the people around them, like ordinary men who had been to the war and returned from it. But the ordinary men they had been before the war were not the men who came back. The men who came back had been shaped by a system that had required them to become compatible with mass death, and that system had succeeded. And the success was not in what the men had won or lost on any specific battlefield, not in the territory gained or the political outcomes achieved, though these things were also real. The success was in the demonstration that human beings could be organized, trained, sustained, and deployed into conditions of almost unimaginable horror and kept there, kept functioning, kept fighting, kept compliant through the application of sufficient institutional pressure and the patient normalization of the intolerable. The war ended in November 1918. The armistice was signed at 11 o'clock in the morning. The guns stopped. Men stood in the trenches and in some cases wept, and in other cases simply stood, and in other cases could not understand what the silence meant because they had not experienced silence for years. The administrative machinery continued. The casualty reports were still filed. The paperwork of the final weeks was completed. The forms were sent. The inventories were made. The letters to next of kin continued to go out for months after the fighting stopped, because the machinery for generating them continued to run on its own momentum, processing deaths that had already occurred, maintaining its routines in the absence of the conditions that had produced them. The final count of military dead on all sides was somewhere between 9 and 10 million, though the precision implied by these figures is illusory. because many of the dead were never accurately recorded, were buried without markers, were destroyed so thoroughly by the weapons that killed them that no individual accounting was possible. The wounded numbered in the tens of millions. The men who returned with psychological injuries that were never formally recognized numbered in the tens of millions. The men who carried the 20 behaviors described in this account back into civilian life, carrying them silently because there was no language to do otherwise, numbered in the tens of millions. The war had been managed. From beginning to end, it had been administered, processed, organized, and documented by institutions that understood the scale of what they were doing, that had the information necessary to make different choices, and that continued to make the choices they made because the logic of the machine required it, because the momentum of the mobilization made stopping harder than continuing, because the individual human cost was not a variable the system was designed to optimize for. The war had been, in this sense, a bureaucratic achievement. The paperwork was nearly complete.